Hello Rooks to Cooks community! For those who don't know me, my name is Chef Shai, and I'm the founder and CEO of Rooks to Cooks. I wanted to take a moment to prepare this video as a thank you for all your amazing support, the kindness, the love that you have shown us throughout this incredibly difficult time. And I wanted to take a second to share one of my utmost favorite holiday recipes of all time, my pear upside down cake with maple whipped cream and candied walnuts. This recipe is my go-to recipe for a quick baked good that's going to wow a crowd. So I'm super pumped to share everything that I know about how to make this recipe and some of the science and the theory behind how to make sure your baked goods are excellent in general with you today. So grab your recipes, get your aprons on, and come bake with me. All right, bakers. So for today's recipe, the first thing that we're going to focus on is actually prepping our pears. All right, once we've prepped our pears, we're gonna move on to our caramel. And after our caramel, we'll work on our batter. After we've assembled our cake and we put it in the oven, that's when we're gonna turn our attention to our candied nuts and our maple whipped cream. To prep our pears, first thing you're going to need is your cutting board, a sharp chef's knife, and of course your pears. To prep the pears, what we wanna make sure is that our pears are equal in thickness and also that they're thin, because at the end of the day, our cake won't be able to bake properly if our pears are too thick. Depending on the size of your pear, you might need 2 pears or might need 1 pear. For my case, I think I might only need 1, but we're gonna see how that goes. To prep our pear, first, take the top off, take the bottom off, and create a flat surface with your pear. It's very important when you're cutting that you always have a flat surface on your board. That way your pear won't roll away from you when you're trying to cut it, and will increase your chances of being safe throughout that process. When it's time to cut, make sure your hand is in a claw position, which creates a flat surface on your knuckles that will be the train track for your knife. You're gonna cut your pear into half, lengthwise, putting the flat surfaces on the board. You're then gonna cut the halves in halves, creating corner. Now that you have a quarter, it's gonna expose the center of your pear, the pits where the seeds are. So we're actually going to remove the core just by cutting a small amount on an angle. Feel free to discard your cores into your green bin. Now, one by one, we're gonna slice our pears about 3 to 4 millimeters thick, so quite thin. When you're slicing, make sure your hand maintains in that claw position at all times. Done slicing your pears, make sure to start preheating your oven. We need a little bit of time for that oven to get to temperature. We are going to preheat our oven to 325 degrees Fahrenheit. Once your pears are prepped, you can just put them aside. Now it's time to prepare our caramel. This caramel is a hard caramel. We're actually going to cook it so that it's at a hard crack stage. Once it cools, it's actually going to be hard, but the moisture in the pears and the moisture in the cake are gonna soften that caramel, turning it into a delicious caramel sauce once we invert our cake. For this stage of the recipe, you're going to require a small pot. It's best that your pot has a thick bottom so that it helps distribute the heat more evenly. At this time, I've put 1/8 of a cup of unsalted butter into my pot, which is about 2 tablespoons. Once you have put your butter in your pot, it's time to melt it. We're actually gonna melt our butter first before we add our brown sugar and we add our cinnamon. It's best to melt your butter over a medium-high heat, and you just wanna cook it until it's melted. We choose to work with unsalted butter because it doesn't have salt in it. And salt is important. Salt's a flavor enhancer, so it helps bring the flavors out in our food. However, too much salt is gonna deter from the sweetness that we're trying to really have convey in this recipe. Once our butter is melted, then it's time to add our 1/3 of a cup of brown sugar packed. After you you've added your 1/3 of a cup of brown sugar, it's time to put this back on the stovetop of about medium-high again, so that we can allow the sugar to cook down and dissolve into our butter, creating that caramel sauce. For this stage, you might want to use a rubber spatula just to help the sugar mix in with the butter. But don't mix too much, or else actually it will split and it won't want to come back together. While your caramel is cooking down, this is a great opportunity to actually line your loaf pan with parchment paper. Parchment paper is actually paper that's been coated in silicone, which repels anything from sticking to it. So we need that parchment paper in order to ensure that our caramel and our cake doesn't stick to our pan. Once all of your sugar has dissolved, and it's very bubbly and you no longer see any granules, then it's time to add your cinnamon. We add our cinnamon at the very last opportunity so that it doesn't burn and doesn't have this bitterness. After you add your cinnamon, it's time to pour it into your loaf pan. Be careful, as this sugar is molten and can burn you. It's also very important at this stage that you spread the caramel out evenly. Now it's time to bring back our pears and start to assemble our top. So now it's time to assemble our pears. And I want you to be very diligent about making sure that every single pear is layered equally. If there's too much pear in one area and not enough in another, it's going to run the risk of not really creating that smooth caramel sauce that you're looking for. So to assemble, make sure that firstly, you go to all corners of your pan. Right? Layer those pears one by one, all in a uniform manner. Overlapping maybe about 2 centimeters each. This is kind of the fun part. Get to be a little bit artistic here. You can choose any fruit that you wish actually. Pears aren't necessary, although fruits that have low moisture, such as apples and pears, seem to work the best. Fruits that have high moisture, such as berries, might run the risk of becoming too moist. After assembling your pears as an even layer, any pears that you have extra, feel free to pile on top of the beautiful layering. Although they won't look pretty, you're not going to see them anyways. They're underneath the layered top that is kind of the aesthetic. Once you've layered your pears on your caramel, you're ready to make your batter. Just set aside for now. We'll come back to it soon. The first thing that we want to do for our batter is put 1/4 of a cup of unsalted butter into a medium bowl. It's important that your butter is room temperature so you can actually whip air into that butter, which is going to help with the rising of our cake. Using a hand mixer or a stand-up mixer with the paddle attachment, what we're going to do next is we're going to put our granulated sugar, quantity is 1/2 of a cup of granulated sugar, into the same bowl as our unsalted butter. Now we're going to cream the sugar and the butter together. We're going to keep creaming until all of the butter and the sugar are incorporated and that they become almost fluffy. That fluffiness is an indication that we've incorporated air, and that air is going to mean our cake is going to rise beautifully. After you've creamed your butter and your sugar, it's time to add your egg. Only 1 egg we're going to add to this recipe. The egg also helps with leavening. It helps our cakes rise, but also it gives it texture, that softness that we're looking for. Now we're going to cream our egg with our butter and sugar until there's no more eggs or yolks or whites visible. This ensures that our cake is going to be smooth. It's also good practice to make sure that you're scraping down the sides of your bowl with a spatula in between additions. Once your eggs and your sugar and your butter have been creamed, it's time to add our wet and our dry ingredients. Today for our dry ingredients, we're working with baking powder and we're working with flour. 2/3 of a cup of all-purpose flour and 1 teaspoon of baking powder. Baking powder is our chemical leavener. This is a chemical that we put into our baked goods to help them rise. This avoids our cake from becoming very dense. On the contrary, it's going to be very fluffy and tender and delicious. Our wet ingredients that we're with today is 2 tablespoons worth of milk and about a half a teaspoon to a teaspoon of vanilla, depending on the potency of your vanilla. If you're unsure, then just use a full teaspoon. For this stage of the recipe, we're going to alternate mixing our milk and mixing our flour. This avoids us overworking our gluten. Gluten is a protein molecule in wheat flour. It's what helps our cake stick together and bind. However, it's tricky. The more we mix our batter, the more tough our gluten becomes. And the tougher it is, the tougher our cake is. The less we mix our batter, the softer our gluten is going to be. And as a result, the more tender our cake is going to be. When we make baked goods, we really want to make sure that we're not overworking our glutens. It's not necessary because it's a batter. We just pour it in and we bake it. If we were making something like a pizza dough, that's when we want to worry about mixing and kneading our gluten so that it's strong, so it can hold up against any stretching or pulling. In this case though, all the work that's needed is just chewing, and we're pretty good at that already. So what we're going to do now is we're going to alternate, starting with half of our milk and vanilla. We're just going to give it a quick mix with our rubber spatula. And then we're going to add in half of our flour. So about 1/3 cup of flour. We're going to fold that in. Folding is a technique where we take the bottom and we bring it to the top. So using our spatula, we bring the bottom to the top, and we keep repeating that pattern and that motion until all of our flour has been taken up by the liquid. Once most of the flour is gone, you can add in the remaining tablespoon and a bit of milk, half a teaspoon of vanilla, and my 1/3 of a cup of flour. After you've added your last bit of flour, time to add your cinnamon, baking powder, and salt. Once again, I'm going to fold, being very careful not to over mix at this stage. I just want to mix until all of my dry flour has been taken up by my wet ingredients. If you notice that you have any clumps, no fear. Just take your spatula and squish the clumps against the side of the bowl, and that will help break them down without overmixing your batter. Once all the clumps are gone and all the dry flour and wet ingredients have mixed together, it's time to pour this delicious batter over your pears. Make sure to get every last drop out of your bowl and on your rubber spatula. There's not a lot of batter to this recipe, so you need every last drop. Once you've poured your batter in, it's important now to spread out your batter so it's nice and even across all the pears. Right when you're ready to put it in the oven, give it a quick shake just to even out any of those areas that you might have missed. Now it's time to put this in the oven for 30 minutes. And there's the timer. So after 30 minutes of baking my cake, it's ready to take out of the oven. If you're not sure if your cake's done, take a toothpick and insert it directly in the center of your cake to test. If the toothpick comes out without any raw batter, it's done. If there's still some maybe batter stuck to the toothpick, put it in for another 5 minutes. While our cake is cooling, now it's time to make our candied nuts and maple whipped cream. So to make our candied nuts, firstly, let's adjust the temperature of our oven. we're gonna bake them at 350. So increase the temperature by 25 degrees. Next, I want you to get your 1 cup of walnuts. They could be any nuts that you wish. You can use peanuts, you can use almonds, you can use even seeds if you're nut free. 1 cup of whatever nut or seed you choose. You're gonna take those nuts and put them in a bowl, and you're gonna take your melted coconut oil and pour it over your nuts or seeds. Using a spoon or a spatula or any really thing that you have on hand, you're just going to stir those nuts with the coconut oil to get them completely coated. The oil acts as almost like a glue to help the sugar stick. If you don't have any coconut oil, you could use unsalted butter or any other saturated fat that you have on hand. After mixing your nuts with your oil, it's time to add your sugar and maple syrup. However, you're only going to add half of each. So only add half your sugar and half your maple syrup. What you're going to do first is you're going to add your cinnamon to your nuts. From there, you're going to add half your sugar, so 1 tablespoon of sugar, and half your maple syrup, so half a tablespoon of maple syrup. The reason why we add it in halves now versus add it all at the beginning is in the oven, the sugar and the maple syrup will fall off the nuts and burn on the sheet pan. So by adding it half and half later, we're going to encourage that sugar to stick to our nuts better. Right before you're finished adding all of your sugar and your maple syrup, throw in a little bit of a pinch of salt for some seasoning. Once your nuts have been mixed and all of the sugar and the maple syrup is well distributed across them, it's time to place the nuts onto a sheet pan. Once again, I've lined my sheet pan with parchment paper so that my nuts don't stick to the pan. Spread your nuts out evenly so that they do not touch each other. This allows the dry heat in the oven to distribute around and come around the nuts, making sure that they're evenly cooked. We're going to bake these now for 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes, and we're going to pull them out and process the rest of the sugar and the maple syrup. So while our nuts are baking, it's time to make our maple syrup whipped cream. In the same bowl that we had our nuts, just add your whipping cream to that bowl. It's very important that your whipping cream is cold, because when it's cold, the fat molecules in our whipping cream are stiff. And if they're stiff, they're going to help trap air more effectively, which means a fluffier whipped cream. Once you've done that, the first step is to whip. We're going to whip our whipping cream until at least soft peaks. You'll notice as you continue to whip, it's going to get thicker and thicker. And that's the air getting stuck and trapped in the fat molecules. So once it reaches soft peak, which is just a stage, a visual cue, a visual stage that we use to determine how far along a whipping cream has come, once it's soft peak, where you see that peak with your whisk and it doesn't really move, you're going to want to add in your maple syrup to taste. Now this cake is very sweet. It has a lot of sugar in it, so we don't need our maple syrup whipped cream to be overly sweet. We want it to be just off sweet so that it actually helps balance out the sweetness of our cake. My rule of thumb is you can always add more, but you can't take away. So for this stage of the recipe, I want you to add a little bit of syrup at a time, whisking it in, tasting and adding more, and whisking it and tasting and adding more. And doing that for as long as you need to get to the taste that you're looking for. Perfect. So now that we've let our cake rest for about 10 minutes, it's time to turn it over. So to do this, be very careful. You want to start by getting a plate or some sort of flat surface and putting it on top of your tin, okay? With one hand on top and one hand on the bottom, and a lot of confidence, you're gonna count to 3 and you're gonna flip it upside down. Ready? 1, 2, and 3. There you go, so it came out nice and clean. I'm gonna carefully carefully remove the parchment paper. And there you have it, our upside down cake. I'm gonna take a moment now just to clean it up the edges, just get rid of any crumbs that might have burnt or might have gotten too hard. And there you go. All of my pears are nice and layered, my caramel has turned to a sauce, and my cake is perfectly fluffy and tender. I cannot wait to dig in. By flipping it upside down, we're just letting the cake cool down even quicker, because now the hottest part of our cake is now exposed to the air. So this will allow our cake to cool down so that by the time we put our whipping cream and our nuts on it, it will actually be ready to support those flavors and textures. So our nuts have been in the oven for about 10 minutes. So what I'm gonna do right now is I'm gonna pour the remaining maple syrup over top of my nuts and sprinkle with the remaining sugar. If we can remember correctly, that is 1 tablespoon of sugar and 1/2 tablespoon of maple syrup. Before I put them back in the oven, I want to give my nuts a little bit of a toss to help distribute the maple syrup and the sugar more evenly. Let's spread them out again and put them back in for about another 5 minutes. In the meantime, let's take some time to actually learn a bit about plating. So this cake, although it's beautiful as a loaf, I like to cut it into small rectangular pieces so that I can really do a nice job plating it and presenting it to my guests. So to cut it, firstly, make sure it's cool enough to cut. It shouldn't have any sort of heat coming off the cake. It should be quite cool, at least room temperature before cutting. Use a very sharp knife and slice down in a rectangular manner. When you're plating, a cake always looks better on a plate when it has some interesting angles. So instead of just choosing to put my cake down straight on my platter, I'm actually going to put a little bit of it on an angle that will attract our eyes and make us think, ooh, what's going on over here? Now with our whipped cream, you can plate on the top of your cake, the side of your cake, however you wish. If you are serving your cake a little bit warm, you can choose to even use ice cream if you'd like. But if you are choosing to serve your cake warm, then make sure to serve your whipping cream on the side of your cake, not the top, otherwise it will melt. Now, perfect timing, my candied nuts just finished cooking. What I'm looking for is that all of the sugar is now molten. I don't see any more granulated sugar left, and that all my nuts are nice and toasted. Also, I use my nose for this one. You're gonna smell that nutty aroma that you're looking for, indicating that your nuts are perfectly toasted. It's time to put our nuts down on our cake. I like to put a little bit on top. Whenever we're plating, you wanna always think of how can I make this plate look taller, because that also is an industry secret for us to make our plates look more appeasing to our guests. And there you have it, everyone. Our pear upside down cake with maple whipped cream and candied walnuts. I can't wait to dig in. I'm sure you can't either. Thank you so much for joining me today and baking along. I really hope that you had a fantastic time and learned a lot through the process. If you like this experience, come join us virtually. We have a ton of options for both adults and children to choose from. And big news, our winter term for after school and weekend courses is now open. So hope to see you soon. Have a fantastic holiday season and stay safe.